In 1 Corinthians 11, does Paul encourage women to cover their hair with a veil? Or is a woman keeping her hair long the only covering that she needs? In this video, we'll go over this debate to find out what kind of covering Paul wanted women to have. In the NASB Bible, the words cover and uncover are used 6 times in 1 Corinthians 11. Here's a few snippets that illustrate this. Every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. For if a woman does not cover her head, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? But the debate over what the covering is comes later in verses 14 and 15. Let's read that now. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. Now, no one disputes that what Paul's talking about here in these 2 verses is hair lengths. That's clear. Men are to have short hair, and women are to keep their hair longer than men's. What's debated is how this passage relates to the rest of Paul's argument about covering. Those who would advocate a cloth or an artificial head covering would say, Paul in this passage is appealing to what nature teaches us about our hair lengths as a reason for why women should use an artificial covering. The other side says, no, this isn't a reason, it's an explanatory passage on what the covering is. It shows that Paul was concerned with hair lengths all along. So, which one is it? I'd like to give you 5 reasons why I believe Paul is speaking about an artificial covering when praying or prophesying. Reason number 1. In verse 15, the Greek word for covering is a completely different word than what was used in the rest of the chapter. Now, do you remember how I said the words cover or uncovered are used 6 times in 1 Corinthians 11? Let's take a look at the first 5 of those references. But every woman who has her head a katakaloptos. For if a woman does not katakalupto her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her katakalupto her head. For a man ought not to have his head katakalupto. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head a katakaloptos? Okay, so we've just looked at 5 of the 6 references for cover and uncover. And we saw that when Paul refers to a covering, he calls it katakalupto, and uncovering a katakaloptos. It's the same Greek word, but the latter is in the negative. Now let's look at the last reference to covering, which comes from verse 15. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her? For her hair is given to her for a peribalion. So even though English versions of the Bible translate both words as covering, Paul differentiates between the 2 by using a completely different Greek word. In the one verse where he's clearly talking about hair lengths, he calls the covering a peribalion. Whereas in the rest of the chapter, when he talks about how women are to worship, he uses katakalupto. So, if verse 15 was an explanatory verse, and Paul was actually talking about our hair lengths all along, wouldn't he have called a woman's long hair katakalupto? Reason number 2. If long hair was the only covering mentioned in this chapter, then there's a major problem with verse 6. Let me show you what I mean. If long hair was the same as being covered according to Paul, what would be being uncovered? It would be having short hair, right? The opposite of covered is uncovered, and the opposite of long hair is short hair. So if that's what Paul had in mind, let's do some word replacement in verse 6. Where we see the words cover her head, let's replace that with have long hair. For if a woman does not have long hair, let her also have her hair cut off. Let's look at that again in another Bible translation. For if a wife will not have long hair, then she should cut her hair short. If you refuse to have long hair, you should cut your hair short? But you'd already have short hair. The argument wouldn't make any sense. He has to be talking about an artificial covering. Reason number 3. Paul is only concerned with covering during specific times. He says in verses 4 and 5, every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. He makes it clear he's not talking about what happens all the time, he's talking about what happens at a specific time. This is about what one wears on their head when they're engaged in worship acts. So the very fact he limits the covering to specific times hints that he has a removable covering in mind. This is something you can put on and take off, not what is permanent, like our hair. Reason number 4. In verse 15, a woman's long hair is called her glory. Whereas earlier in verse 10, Paul says a woman is to wear a symbol of authority on her head. The fact that these two purposes are antithetical shows us that more than one covering is being discussed. One is natural, the other artificial. One permanent, the other removable. One is a glorious thing, the other is symbolizing submission to authority. Reason number 5. Finally, the fact that the church unanimously understood Paul to mean an artificial covering until recent times is a very strong point. We're talking about 1900 years of history with the church all saying the same thing. And the attestation to head covering being artificial rather than long hair is really early. For example, Tertullian, writing only 150 years after Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 11, said that the church in Corinth was still practicing veiling in his own day. He said, "So too did the Corinthians themselves understand him. In fact, at this day the Corinthians do veil their virgins. What the apostles taught, their disciples approved." Clement of Alexandria, writing around the same time, said, "Woman and man are to go to church decently attired, for this is the wish of the word, since it is becoming of her to pray veiled." And Hippolytus said, "Let all the women have their heads covered with an opaque cloth." So in light of the witness of church history, the differentiation in Greek words, the verse 6 problem passage, the fact that covering is only for a specific time, and that covering is a symbol of authority, not her glory, it's best to understand Paul is saying that women are to have long hair, but during times of worship, they're to cover it with a veil.